Thank you, Luke, and thank you, Jeremy, for that brief introduction to market reform in electricity. Good afternoon, folks, and thank you for staying to listen to the second half of the show. After the excitements of this morning, we have the afternoon lunchtime snooze slot, so I will cut to the chase and be as brief as I possibly can. I only have pictures. I don't have any charts at all, aside from the words that are up here. All the key information that I'll talk about today is available via Google on our website. So if people are interested on how we did it and what we did, just Google it. I'm sure you've got Wi-Fi here. You can Google away right now and save me the bother. But I have a few points really before I get started, which outline what I've put up on this slide. I think really the key point is historically, energy and land ownership have been intrinsically linked. And this slide that we're looking at, if you can look past the writing, you see what is the Dearg wind farm site before we started planting wind turbines on it. And what you can see there, if you were wandering around in your wellies, is that that site was cleared of timber in the Bronze Age, then into the Iron Age, and the trees that used to stand up there were very largely used to fuel the bloomeries, the primitive iron smelters that flourished in Argyll up until the 1600s, I guess. Wood gave way to coal, very largely as the landowning families, and I'm talking in a UK context here, the landowning families pioneered coal mining as the coal was used as a means to fuel their land-improving lime kilns. If you go around Scotland and up to the highest hills, you will find the remains of lime kilns. Some of them were powered by wood, some of them by peat, but in this part of the world, an awful lot of them were powered by coal. Now, that was the origins of land ownership and fuel as we know it today. Coal is still the primary thermal fuel in the world's energy production. And of course, the combination of these coal mines with the iron, particularly in the central belt here in Scotland, sowed the seeds for the Industrial Revolution. A connection with thermal energy, which was only broken during the Second World War as all the UK coal assets were nationalised. I think the other point I have to make here generally is that where land ownership is solely focused on the wealth preservation of the landowners, it's always going to be open to criticism from the landless and their political sponsors. And I know that's a particular issue at the moment for this organisation, but what I'm going to explain today is really how we focused our efforts on wealth creation with the assets that we had. Now, as Jeremy has spoken about, and as the speakers this morning mentioned in passing, with the demand for green energy, landowners have the opportunity to reconnect with the enterprise of energy production and take a leading role through that connection in rural economic development. A little bit of background on where we are at Ormsary. We're in mid-Argyll, about 2 hours drive from Glasgow, providing the rest, and be thankful, hasn't been washed out, in which case it's 3 hours going round on the ferry. Providing the ferry's not off with the wind, in which case it's a lot longer. As we found out when our wind turbines got stuck at George IV Dock just by IKEA in Glasgow. Ormsary is typical of many West Highland estates and many of the estates that I think will have been involved in the survey we're hearing about this morning. It's very beautiful. It's very remote. We don't have great broadband, and it's damn expensive to maintain. We have limited economic opportunities, And it is frankly very hard work to maintain sufficient enterprise in that landscape to sustain an economically viable rural community. But we do have terrible wet and windy weather. Now, that is a brief summary of Ormsary. There are no numbers there, but you can see the various things that go on, and I'm sure many of you will be familiar with these in your own patches. But it's a living estate, and represented here by various mugshots that I actually put together for the first planning application involving the wind farm. That's our canary down the mine. That's the Akerhoish Primary School. It's quite a new school. We always struggle to keep the school roll up above a critical level. In Argyll, that's a particularly rural school closures is a particularly hot issue. And for us, as I say, it's the canary down the mine. Once the working and breeding age population drops below a critical level, it is extremely difficult to recover a rural community. Anyone that spends any time in the West Highlands can see that. Where you've got a school, you've got some activity. Where the school is closed, you know that essentially you are looking at an economically inert part of the world. And families do not want to settle without good schooling. I mean, we talked about connectivity, but actually it's pretty basic. You can't expect young children to be spending 2 hours a day in the back of the school bus. So, keeping economically unsustainable communities afloat is unaffordable to most private landowners. Right, this is a view from the wind farm, a great red stag there. We're looking down on Loch Gilphead, that's the buildings in the distance, and that is Loch Gilp, so we're looking sort of to the northeast. As I said, like a lot of Scotland, we do have really terrible weather. That ground is no good for farming. It's too high for trees. You can see the trees below us, my neighbour's trees. It's no good for tourists, and I don't mean that in the sense that we can't attract people to come here, but the reality is most people in this country would rather they went where it was warm and sunny than where it was prevailingly wet, and when it's warm it's pretty midgy. So it isn't a great place for tourism. It's certainly not a good place for farming, and it's pretty hard work to live with. However, we do have 2 meters of rain a year, combined with relatively high, about 1,500 feet, and windy, barren hills, which are ideal conditions for renewable energy production, both for hydro and for wind now. Now, we're not strangers to renewable energy. Actually, Ormsary, the first hydro scheme went in 1913. My grandfather put that in. He was busy for a few years, but when he came back, he put in another scheme in 1919. Now, the 1919 scheme is still operational, and we are finally going to get round to finishing out our hydro development at Ormsary next year, in part because of what Jeremy is saying. We've got a window of opportunity, and now's the time to get a scheme in if you possibly can. However, what I wanted to really speak about today was wind power, and particularly our experience in developing our own community project at Dearg. Dearg came about by a stroke of luck, and we all need some luck. Well, certainly I've needed luck in my life, especially if you're trying to make things happen in a remote and economically disadvantaged part of the world. We had followed the classic default route on wind, as I'm sure many of you here will have done or will be doing. We had a beauty parade with Savills, and we entered into a lease option with a large foreign developer. They wanted a very large-scale scheme. That's how they roll. That's what they need to do. They need to be putting up 20, 30, 40, 50 megawatts to make it worth their while. The issue with that was that it was very intrusive onto the landscape, and where we are there, we're highly visible from the Loch Fyne area. Over the other side, we were highly visible from the Knapdale National Scenic Area. And it was very unpopular. It was not back at planning. There was a statutory objection from SNH. We were not, as landowners, and it was Ormsary estate and the neighbouring estate of Stronahoolan, we were not involved directly in that process. But initially, when it was not back at planning, it was a pretty good blow. I mean, that was quite an income stream that suddenly evaporated like the mist from the hill. However, that has turned out to be a multi-million-pound blessing in disguise. The time the developer pulled out in 2009, we sat back to consider our options. Various people were very keen to promote their services to us. Were we to take on another developer, or actually were we to have a go at it ourselves? Well, that's where our luck held, or my luck held. We linked up with a chap called Steve Macken, who had a small wind farm advisory development business called Lomond Energy. He works out of a retired cow buyer in Gartahan, Loch Lomond side. And it was he who persuaded us that we should take the planning forward ourselves. We did most of it ourselves because it's an expensive process. We had to spend some money on landscape architects, but otherwise we kept it in-house with the resources that the estate had. The critical part about the proposal that we went back with was it was very much smaller, and it addressed the key landscape concerns, which is scale. That's what the landscape architects get terribly excited about. Is your turbine going to diminish the scale of the surrounding landscape? So you put in smaller turbines, they're not as high, but they can also sit a lot closer to each other. They don't have to be so spread out. So we reduced the scale. We came up with something that ultimately was acceptable to SNH. Our third stroke of luck came when we were approached by the neighbouring Ardrishig Community Council, or by the council chairman. That's an organisation that not unusually in these sorts of situations had been very vocal and very opposed to the previous planning application. They formed a community trust and joined the project as partners, and they've now ended up actually owning 1/12 of the project. They worked very hard within the community to bring them into the project, to bring a community buy-in, and brought the community in as an engaged partner rather than simply the more common model, which is a passive recipient of what the industry calls community benefit payments. This engagement does require the critical mass of interested and involved local people, and it's not always easy to identify who and how to involve the community. And really in that regard, with the benefit of hindsight, I look back and say, yeah, we were very lucky. We've been able to do it elsewhere, but critically at that point, we were very lucky. So we had set out to maximise the economic benefit retained in Argyll and secure planning consent on this basis against a recommendation to refuse by the local planning officer for various complex reasons that I won't go into here, but we had tremendous local support from our councillors, and we got planning consent in summer 2010. That was a big party. Right, the mechanics of how this thing worked. The project cost 15 million to build. We borrowed most of this from the cooperative bank. Fortunately, just before they discovered they didn't actually have any money to lend, but we were lucky. And we bridged the funding gap by bringing in external partners from the City of London, who brought in cash and also experience. And as it happened, we brought in Natural Power's experience to build the project. Right, I'm going to race through this. This is what the industry called tower erection. With a local control, we're able to ensure that as much work as possible is retained in Argyll. That is what we set out to do. These tower sections were made just down the road in Campbelltown. They were brought up the road by McFadgen's, our local haulier, who is the country's expert on moving bits of wind turbines around. The roadworks were done by a firm called McNaughton's in Lochgilphead that some of you may use for your forestry roads. We kept about £3 million spent in Argyll. Now, £3 million in this city is not a big deal, but in rural Argyll, that's a lot of cash being retained in the economy. That's the last tower going up. You can see Mull in the background, and that was the middle of August 2012, and we needed nice, calm conditions. Right, the sunset shot. This is actually a before and after shot. This is the after shot from my opening slide, as my brother pointed out yesterday. These are the girls that pulling hard on January January last year. You can see Isla and Jura just off to the distance. We went to full output. Our full output is just under 10 megawatts on Christmas Eve last year, Christmas Eve 2012. That was 3 months ahead of schedule. We have 12 850 kilowatt machines. These are tiny machines now by comparison to what the industry is going for, but we needed the wee machines to keep the site compact and unobtrusive, relatively speaking. We deliberately stayed under the 10 megawatt grid connection level because once you go above 10 megawatts, the cost and expense of your grid connection goes up through the roof. Last year, we were the best performing wind farm in Great Britain. I say Great Britain advisedly, not, there is a small wind farm, very small wind farm in Northern Ireland, which for some reason did slightly better than us. I don't know why. And we supplied about 15% of the domestic electricity in Argyll. We sold over £4 million worth of electricity. Now, for a rural estate, £4 million of sales. Of course, we are only a partner in it. We don't own the whole thing, but 4 million is 4 million quid. That's cash coming in. It's a very windy site. We have an average wind speed up at the turbine tops at 20 miles an hour, and gusts last year we went over 115 miles an hour. That's quite windy. That's when trucks will roll over if you're silly enough to drive up there in those conditions. But most importantly, the key part of this is 85% of the economic benefit. Now, you know, I'm not an economist, but that's the cash that stays local, has been retained in Argyll. We've created 4 new jobs, but this income has transformed the economies of the estate partners. That's Ormsary and our neighbouring estate, Stronahoolan. And as we heard this morning, most of that money is being spent locally. From the community aspect, the Ardrishig Trust has received £210,000 to date. So the first money came in last April. The last money, which was just over 80,000, landed with Ardrishig a couple of weeks ago. What's interesting is that is roughly £50,000 more in direct community benefit payment, so cash which is going to the community councils or to the various trusts that are out there. That's £50,000 more than all the other commercial operators, which is 137 megawatts of installed capacity versus 10. Sorry, I haven't put the numbers up, but the reality is we've put a darn sight more cash into the local communities than all the other commercial operators put together. Separately, we have an educational trust fund which spreads the benefit slightly wider. Wind farms. Yeah, there'll be those amongst you that are for them, those amongst you that are definitely against them. And there are plenty of downsides, I know that, but quite a few of those downsides are fictional. And I know that also because I'm now involved in the thing. If you have a smaller scheme, you have a smaller landscape impact. It still provides a significant income for an estate. And it's a very different attitude for a community when you know the distant view of turbines is a direct economic benefit to you and your family and your community, and not simply funding a German municipal pension scheme or even the French state, in the case of EDF, who are anxious to develop a large wind farm next door to us. Right, on to a little bit of hydro. That looks a mess. That's a couple of years ago. A hydro scheme that my brother developed on his estate at Inver on the Isle of Jura. Inver is really a hydro scheme now with a fantastic traditional sporting estate attached. The whole scheme is within the Jura National Scenic Area. Completed 2012. Again, all local contractors. Jura, as a result, is now a net electricity exporter. It's still an energy importer because the distillery consumes a huge amount distilling, but in terms of electricity, it sticks out more than it consumes, and it provides a six-figure income for the estate. It's also the UK's largest private hydro scheme in terms of energy generation. My final point, and I've used the word adventure, because that's pretty much what it was when we started off. We didn't know quite what we were getting into, and like a lot of adventures, it had its ups and downs. It was very hard work, but we ended up at a very successful conclusion. Land is the key asset in renewable energy, and you can't overlook that in a forum like this. I would urge anyone to retain control of their projects, because where is the pleasure in ownership without control? Retain the maximum value within the local economy and help increase the economic resilience of our otherwise very fragile and vulnerable rural communities. And it's a lot more fun than Sitka spruce, I can tell you that. Very finally, everyone's circumstances are different. We don't set out Dearg as the way to go, as the only way to go, but it has for us been a very successful combination of local community and estate. It's worked very well, and we are aiming to extend this model this year and next with another 6 megawatts, bringing in the other communities. So if anyone has any queries on this, please just go to the website. If there's things that you need to ask, just contact me through the website. But if you possibly have the option to do this, I would strongly recommend that you give it a lot of thought. And if you possibly can, give it a try, because it's a lot better than having a tenant sat there up your hill. Thank you.